Tonight's story is called The Move to the New Beach. Subscribe to stay on top of the next story and hear more peaceful journeys like this. Each one made to help you drift off slowly, gently, and deeply. And before you close your eyes completely, we'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below and let us know. Chapter 1: Boxes, Buckets, and a Breeze. The very first thing Eli noticed about the new beach was how it sounded before it could be seen. It wasn't loud, just different. Like the sea, there had its own way of breathing. He sat in the back seat of the little blue car, hugging a bucket on his lap. Not just any bucket, but the one he used to build castles, collect shells, and carry small, round stones that reminded him of soft moons. His sister, Mara, sat beside him, staring out the window as houses and fences slowly gave way to tall, golden grasses. Their old beach, with its familiar tide and sand that remembered their footprints, was behind them now. They weren't going back. Do you think the new sand will feel the same? Eli asked quietly. Mara shrugged, but not in a mean way. Just the kind of shrug that meant, I wonder that too. Their parents were up front, talking softly. The car hummed along the coast road, winding gently like a stream, trying to remember where it last left off. It had been weeks of sorting, packing, folding, and letting go. Each drawer and box from their old house had been touched one last time. But Eli had only really cared about two things, his bucket and the beach. The new one. The one they hadn't met yet. When they arrived, the house was smaller, but closer. Close enough that the salt breeze greeted them on the porch. Close enough that Eli could hear the seagulls even from his room upstairs. That night, after boxes had been stacked and beds had been made only halfway, Eli opened his window just a little. The breeze came in soft and carrying something in it. Not words, not smells, just a promise. Come see. The next morning, Eli didn't wait for breakfast. He slipped on his sandals, held his bucket carefully, and tiptoed past the towers of unopened boxes. Mara heard him and followed, not because she wanted to get up early, but because she knew something important was happening. Something small and quiet and worth remembering. They didn't talk much as they walked down the winding path between tall dune grass. The air was cooler here, the kind that made your lungs feel a little newer. When the beach finally opened up before them, they both stopped. It was wider than their old beach, and quieter. Not because it was empty, the waves were there, and the breeze, and the sky, but because it hadn't learned their names yet. This sand's a different color, Mara said softly. It was. Paler, with flecks of something that caught the light like sun freckles. Eli knelt down, scooped a little into his bucket, and let it pour through his fingers. It sifted slower than the old beach, as if it wanted to take its time. I think this beach listens longer before it answers, he said. Mara blinked at him. That doesn't make sense. But she sat down beside him anyway, and didn't say another word. They stayed that way for a long time, just sitting. Not playing yet. Not building. Just watching the tide. And for the first time, the beach seemed to watch them back. Chapter 2: Discovering Quiet Corners. The next morning, the sun stretched its fingers over the pale sand, painting the beach in soft gold. Eli woke early again, his mind buzzing with the quiet promise the new beach had whispered the day before. Mara was slower to rise. But by the time Eli had finished breakfast, if you could call dry cereal and cold milk breakfast, they were both ready. Today, they were explorers. Their parents had unpacked some boxes overnight, but most were still stacked in the living room like small towers waiting to be climbed or toppled. Eli had tried both, but Mara had gently stopped him. "Not today," she said, eyes still heavy with sleep. Outside, the beach beckoned. They wandered past the dunes, where sea oats swayed like slow dancers. The wind carried a faint salt smell, but also something else, a soft, earthy scent that seemed to belong to the beach itself. It was different from their old place, where the sand had smelled only of salt and sunshine. "Look," Mara said, pointing. Not far from the water's edge was a small cluster of smooth stones, arranged like a circle. Eli knelt down beside them, tracing the stones with his fingers. They felt warm from the morning sun. The circle wasn't perfect, but it seemed deliberate. Someone had placed it there. "Maybe it's a secret meeting spot," Eli whispered. Mara smiled. Together, they looked around and saw more signs of quiet life: a crab scuttling sideways between seaweed, a cluster of tiny shells glimmering in the sun, a piece of driftwood shaped like a boat. Each discovery was small, but felt important. As they moved along the shore, Eli noticed how the waves didn't rush to the sand like at their old beach. Instead, they paused, a gentle hesitation, as if the sea was saying hello before stepping in. "Do you think the beach remembers people?" Eli asked, looking up at Mara. She shrugged, but her eyes were thoughtful. "Maybe it remembers feeling." Eli liked that answer. They found a quiet cove surrounded by jagged rocks, where the water pooled in calm blue-green pools. Here, the breeze was softer, and the sand beneath their feet was cool and fine. They spent hours exploring the cove's quiet corners, finding tiny fish hiding under rocks and watching the way the sunlight made patterns on the water's surface. When the tide began to turn, Eli pulled out his bucket and began collecting shells and smooth stones to bring home. Mara sat quietly on a rock, watching the waves, a small smile playing on her lips. That night, as they unpacked their treasures on the kitchen table, Eli realized something. The new beach wasn't just different, it was a place that asked to be noticed, to be understood slowly and gently. And Eli and Mara were ready to listen. Chapter 3: The Tide's Whisper. The morning sun spilled soft light through the curtains, filling Eli's new room with a quiet glow. Outside, the gentle hum of the ocean called him again, a steady, calming rhythm like a heartbeat beneath the world. Eli dressed quickly, eager to step outside. Mara was already waiting at the door, a small notebook tucked under her arm. "Ready to explore more?" she asked with a smile. Definitely, Eli said, grabbing his shoes. But when they stepped onto the porch, they noticed the sky was cloudier than the day before. The breeze felt cooler, carrying a hint of rain. Still, the beach was too tempting to ignore. They headed down the sandy path, their footsteps light on the soft ground. As they approached the shoreline, the waves seemed quieter, less rushing, more like a gentle whisper. Mara opened her notebook and began to sketch the shapes of the clouds, the curve of the waves, and the scattered shells along the shore. Eli watched her for a moment, then knelt to pick up a smooth, pale stone. It was cool in his palm, almost silky. "The beach changes, doesn't it?" Eli said thoughtfully. "Not just the waves or the sand, but everything." Mara nodded. "It's like it has its own rhythm, its own stories." They wandered toward a small dune where wildflowers bloomed in splashes of yellow and purple. Between the plants, tiny footprints marked the sand, maybe a small bird or a crab, leaving its quiet trail. Eli crouched beside the prints. "It's like the beach keeps secrets in these little marks." Suddenly, a soft breeze lifted Mara's notebook, flipping the pages quickly. "Whoa," she laughed, chasing after it before the wind could carry it further. Eli helped her catch it, and as they sat together, the sky darkened with rolling clouds. A few drops of rain began to fall, cool and light. Instead of running away, they stayed under the branches of a nearby tree, watching the rain beat on leaves and drip onto the sand. "The beach is different when it rains," Mara said softly. Eli smiled. "It's like the tide's whisper changes voice." They listened to the soft patter of rain mingling with the ocean's gentle song. When the clouds drifted away and the sun peeked through again, a rainbow arched across the sky, bright and hopeful. Eli and Mara looked at each other, knowing this new beach wasn't just a place to visit, it was a place to feel, to watch, and to understand slowly, like the tide itself. And each day held a new story waiting just beneath the surface. Chapter 4: The Hidden Cove. The next morning arrived clear and crisp, with a soft golden light spilling over the dunes. Eli and Mara had decided to explore farther along the shore, curious about what the new beach might still be hiding. As they walked, the gentle crunch of sand underfoot mixed with the distant call of seabirds. The ocean stretched wide to their right, sparkling under the early sun, while thick patches of coastal grasses swayed softly on their left. After some time, Eli spotted something unusual ahead, a narrow path winding through a cluster of jagged rocks. "Look, Mara," he called softly. "A trail. I wonder where it leads." Mara's eyes lit up with excitement. "Let's find out." They carefully made their way through the rocks, stepping lightly so as not to disturb the tiny crabs scurrying about. At the end of the path, the landscape opened up into a small, secluded cove. The water here was calmer, forming a glassy pool surrounded by smooth stones and shells in every shade of white, pink, and amber. The cove felt like a secret world, tucked away from the rest of the beach, a quiet place where the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Eli knelt by the water's edge and dipped his fingers into the cool, clear water. "It's like the sea saved this just for us," he whispered. Mara pulled out her notebook, sketching the outline of the cove and the delicate patterns of the shells. "Places like this," she said, "remind me that there's always more to discover if you take the time to look." As the tide began to creep higher, the pool shimmered with reflections of clouds drifting slowly above. They stayed a little longer, watching how the sunlight danced on the water's surface. Before they left, Eli found a smooth, flat stone and set it carefully at the water's edge. "For the next visitors," he said with a smile. Mara nodded. "A little welcome gift from us." As they walked back through the rocky path, their hearts felt lighter. The cove had given them something special, a place to remember whenever the world felt too big or too loud. The new beach was starting to feel like home, one secret at a time. Chapter 5, Where the Waves Leave Messages. By the time their second week at the new beach began, Eli and Mara had already found favorite spots, places that felt like theirs alone. The tall dunes near the cottage, the path of sun-warmed stones behind the tidal-pools, and of course, the hidden cove. But something about this morning felt different. The sky was soft with cloud cover, and the waves rolled in with a slow, even rhythm, like the sea was speaking in its sleep. "Let's walk early today," Mara said as she tied the laces on her weathered sneakers. Eli was already at the window, watching the tide pull back. "I think the beach wants to tell us something." They packed a thermos of warm lemon tea, their notebooks, and a blanket, then headed down the same path they always did, though now, it felt like a ritual all their own, even without needing that word. Today, the shore was scattered with driftwood in strange shapes, seaweed that curled like calligraphy, and small spiral shells resting on the damp sand like punctuation marks in a letter. They spread out their blanket not far from the edge of the retreating tide and sat quietly. The air smelled of salt and soft wind. After a few quiet sips of tea, Mara noticed something. "Eli," she said gently, pointing to the sand near the water. "Look." There, written in the sand as clearly as a sentence, were small curves and lines that seemed deliberate. Like symbols, almost. The waves had retreated just enough to reveal them, and now lingered just out of reach. "Did someone do that?" Eli whispered. Mara shook her head. "I don't think so." The lines weren't footprints or seaweed marks. They were delicate, winding, and spaced like handwriting in a letter from someone who took their time. A few moments later, another wave rolled in, slow and glassy, and when it pulled back again, another set of lines appeared, just beyond the first. "It's like the tide is writing," Eli said, breathless. They didn't move. They didn't speak. Wave after wave, more curved lines appeared, like a secret language being spelled out slowly, one phrase at a time. Neither of them knew what the message said, but it wasn't scary. It wasn't loud. It felt kind. Almost thoughtful. Like the ocean was saying, "I see you. I'm glad you're here." The last wave brought with it a small cluster of sea pebbles, arranged in a perfect ring. Eli picked them up, one by one, and held them in his palm. "They're warm," he said. "From the sea." Mara took out a blank page and began to sketch the pattern of the lines, not to figure them out, but to remember how they made her feel. When the tide began to rise again, the sea gently erased its message, smoothing the sand until it looked untouched. But Eli and Mara knew better. They sat together a little while longer, listening to the waves. No words were needed. The new beach had spoken, and they had listened. The open mouth of the cave. It shaped its stories in stone. A wide, shadowed mouth in the cliffs that only appeared when the tide rolled away far enough to leave behind something old and waiting. Tess had always been curious. She and her younger brother, Lark, spent most of the summer walking the long shoreline near their grandmother's weathered house. The beach never looked exactly the same 2 days in a row. Shells drifted in new patterns, seaweed curled like writing, and sometimes strange marks crisscrossed the sand, as though something had passed through quietly in the night. They noticed the cave one late afternoon, just before the sky turned its soft evening colors. The water had pulled back farther than usual, and there, pressed into the side of the cliff, was a dark, cool shape. It wasn't hidden, but it never called attention to itself. It was just there. The way driftwood is just there, or the still pools that hold pieces of the sky. Lark tilted his head. Has that always been there? I don't think so, Tess replied. Not like that. They didn't rush toward it. The wind had quieted, and the air felt heavier than usual. Not frightening, just heavier, like a blanket pressed gently over the shoulders. The cave wasn't deep, not at first. But as they stepped closer, it seemed to pull the light away from the sand. The inside curved, not sharply, but slowly, like the start of a thought still forming. Tess stopped just before the entrance. Lark crouched to pick up a smooth stone shaped like an almond. They stood still, and the beach stood still with them. A single bird called somewhere high above. Farther off, the waves whispered their long exhale. Tess didn't speak, but she didn't step away either. Whatever this place was, it wasn't waiting to surprise anyone. It had always been part of the beach. They had simply never seen it this clearly. She glanced at Lark. We'll come back, she said, when the tide goes low again. And they did. Chapter 2, The Sheep Beneath the Sand. The next morning, Tess and Lark were already up before the sun had finished lifting the mist from the shore. They didn't speak much during breakfast. Just small glances and quiet movements, as if they both knew today would feel different. By the time they reached the beach, the tide was already heading out, peeling itself gently away from the rocks and leaving thin lines of foam in its wake. Tess had brought a notebook and a small tin of colored pencils. Lark carried a cloth bag with 2 water bottles and a snack. They walked slowly at first, letting their feet find the colder patches of sand. The sea's retreat had left behind tentacles that blinked up at them like eyes, full of motion, but still. When they reached the cave, it was open again, even wider than the day before, but still quiet, still waiting. They stepped inside, just a little farther this time. The air changed the moment they crossed the line where sun gave way to shade. It was cooler, but not cold. The kind of cool that held stories in its walls. Stone above them, stone to either side. And beneath their feet, sand. Soft and packed, but with small ridges. Like something had been dragged or rolled long ago. Tess knelt and ran her fingers along the ridges. Lark crouched beside her. "Do you think someone used to come here?" he asked. "I think maybe the cave was part of something," she replied. "Not used. Just known." Lark didn't answer. He looked deeper into the cave's curve. It wasn't a tunnel, not really. It wound gently inward, as though the beach had once folded in on itself. They moved forward together, slow and careful. Further in, the sand began to change color. Golden brown became a cooler gray, and scattered across it were small, flat stones arranged like stepping paths. Tess stopped. "That's not random." "No," Lark agreed, and without thinking, stepped onto the first stone. Nothing moved. But there was a sound, small and soft, like a distant breath. Tess stepped forward too. As they walked from stone to stone, something became clearer. The stones weren't just paths. They were shaped. Not symbols. Not letters. Just simple curves and lines, pressed into place like someone had once wanted to remember the flow of water or the curl of a breeze. Farther in, they found a space where the cave widened. A low ceiling stretched overhead, and the sand beneath their feet felt warmer again, dry, but soft, like the edge of dunes. Here, the air didn't echo. Here, it held still. They sat. Not because they were tired, but because it felt right to be still in that moment. Tess opened her notebook and began to draw, not what she saw, but what the space felt like. Lines that curved gently toward one another, like waves resting instead of moving. Shapes that seemed to bend toward a quiet center. Lark lay back on the sand, watching a patch of light shimmer high on the wall, reflected from a tide-pool outside. "I think this is the kind of place the wind remembers," he said. Tess smiled, not at him, but at the way he said it. They stayed longer than they meant to, but not too long. When the first wave reached the edge of the cave again, curling in like a gentle hand, they stood, gathered their things, and left the way they came. The sun was higher now, casting the sky into pale golds and soft blues. Back at the top of the dunes, they turned to look behind them. The cave was still visible, but just barely. Already, the tide was starting its return. And the beach, in its steady way, began to smooth over their steps. Chapter 3, The Low Tide Ledger. The cave didn't vanish. It waited. Not every day revealed it. Some mornings the tide curled too high, foam touching the dune grass, washing over every inch of rock and sand. But the days that followed the calmest nights, those were different. Those were the days Tess and Lark came early. And on the third such morning, they brought something new, a narrow wooden box, flat and old, that Tess had found in her mother's storage chest. It was empty now, once used to hold sewing tools, but it had a small brass clasp and a velvet lining, and Tess thought it felt like something that wanted to be filled again. They didn't know what, exactly, but something. Down the path and through the soft hush of the dunes, the beach felt broader today. The air was warm, but not heavy, and the light came in wide bands, slanted sunbeams that painted the sand in stripes of gold and blue-gray. The tide was out. Far out. So far, in fact, that the mouth of the cave looked wider than ever, almost stretched. The shadows inside didn't just hold still, they leaned outward, curious. Lark paused at the entrance. "You think it'll ever disappear completely?" he asked. Tess shook her head. "I think it's always here. Just, sometimes it hides better." They stepped inside together, more confidently now. Each return visit had revealed more. Not just of the cave, but of what waited within it. The flat stones they had first stepped on days ago were part of a wider pattern now visible at low tide, a slow, spiraling line etched in alternating pale and dark stones that circled the cave's middle. In that spiral, sea glass had been gently placed in wide arcs. Green, blue, amber, and rarely clear, like frozen breath. Tess knelt, brushing sand from a small section, uncovering more glass they hadn't noticed before. "There's a rhythm to this," she whispered. "Someone laid this out like a thought that kept growing." Lark stepped beyond the spiral, where the back wall of the cave curved tightly inward. That's where he found it. A shallow depression in the wall, shaped almost like a shelf. And on that shelf, resting gently in a dry patch of sand, was a piece of folded fabric. Inside it, a collection of smooth, oblong stones, each marked with a single carved line. Some vertical, some diagonal. A few looped like the curl of a shell. Lark didn't touch them. He called Tess over instead. She stared at them, quiet. "They're like a kind of language," she said. "But not ours." "No. Not ours." Tess took out her notebook and copied them carefully, one by one. And when they stepped back from the wall, something shifted in the cave. A soft rustling sound, like wind catching between leaves, echoed across the stones. They turned. The spiral was glowing faintly. Not brightly. Just enough that the sea glass caught the light and held it like little mirrors. "Do you feel that?" Lark asked. Tess nodded. The cave's listening. They stood in the center of the spiral and opened the wooden box. Inside, they placed one pencil, blunted from use. One sea glass shard, blue like dusk. One torn page from Tess's notebook, marked with all the shapes from the wall. And they left it there, on the sand, in the center of the spiral. They didn't speak as they left the cave. They didn't need to. Outside, the tide was rising again, slowly curling back into itself. But behind them, they could feel it. The cave had accepted something. Not a gift. Not an offering. Just a record. A kind of note in the sand, gently placed where time could find it. Chapter 4: The Water That Didn't Come Back. Lark was the first to notice it. 3 days had passed since the spiral glowed, 3 days since they left the wooden box in the cave, and something about the tide had changed. It wasn't that it came in slower. It was that it stopped short. Each morning, they returned to the beach and watched the waves curl forward, pause, and then hesitate. As if the sea itself remembered something. On the 4th morning, Tess stood at the top of the dune with a hand shading her eyes. "See that line?" she said. Lark followed her gaze. There, about 10 feet from where the tide normally stretched, the sand changed color. Lighter. Undisturbed. It hadn't been touched by water in days. "But there's no wind mark," Tess added. "No dry spray or shore break. It's like the sea chose to stop." Lark ran a finger through the sand, tracing that invisible boundary. It felt colder. Even here. The cave's mouth was open again, wider than ever, its edges no longer sharp with shadows but soft, almost rounded. They stepped inside. This time, they brought nothing. No satchel. No notebook. Just themselves. The spiral still shimmered faintly, even in the daylight. And in the center, the wooden box had changed. It was still there, untouched by water or sand, but inside, the paper had been unfolded. And written across its back, in an ink neither of them recognized, was a single shape. A curve. Almost like a wave. Almost like a smile. Tess bent over it. "It's not one of the marks from the stones. This is new." Lark tilted his head. "Or maybe it's old. Older than the others." They carried the box out into the light. As soon as it left the spiral, something else happened. A sound. Distant. Deep. Not like thunder, but lower, like a drum beneath the earth. Tess froze. "It's below." They looked at each other. Then down the beach. Far to the right, where the sand narrowed and the cliffs curved inward, a new pattern had formed in the wet sand. A small channel. Barely a foot wide. And it was dry. Not dried out. Just dry. Like water had once flowed there, regularly, and then, simply, never returned. Tess stepped toward it, drawn without thinking. Lark followed. The channel led them closer to the cliffs, past tangles of driftwood and shells split open by sun and time. And then the channel ended, abruptly. Into rock. But not just any rock. There, at the cliff's base, was a seam. Straight. Narrow. Clean. A door-shaped mark, just tall enough for the two of them to enter side by side. Tess ran her fingers along it. "This wasn't carved," she said. "It was worn. Or grown. like the spiral. Lark reached into his pocket and pulled out the page he'd torn from the notebook, the one marked with the cave stone symbols. And at the very bottom, the newest shape, the wave-like curve, had bled through. On the reverse side, the paper was damp. But his hands weren't wet. Neither was his pocket. "It's from here," he whispered. "Not the cave. This is where it came from." Tess stared at the seam. It didn't open. It didn't glow. It just waited. They didn't go in. Not yet. They sat on the sand, backs against the cliff, and listened. The waves behind them still rolled, still breathed. But that line, the one where the water stopped, hadn't moved. And when they closed their eyes, they could hear something else. A breath that wasn't the tide. Not quite wind. Not quite voice. Something between and below. Chapter 5, The Voice Beneath the Sand. They returned at dusk. Tess and Lark had watched the sea all day, tracing every wave's retreat, every curl of foam, every moment the water chose to stop at that same invisible line. It hadn't moved. The tide was still breathing, yes, but quieter now. As if listening back. The channel in the sand still pointed the way. And the seam in the cliff, what had looked like a door without a handle, waited, unchanged. But tonight, something had shifted in the air. Not the kind of shift that comes with storms or cold fronts. This was softer, stranger. Like the sky had lowered its voice. Like the beach itself wanted to whisper. They stood before the seam again. And this time, the wind did not pass around them. It passed through. Lark pressed his hand to the rock, and Tess joined him. Nothing happened. Then something did. Not a crack. Not a glow. A feeling. A warmth low in the chest. Like the echo of a name not spoken aloud. And suddenly, the sand behind them shifted. Not violently. Not to startle. But as if remembering its own shape. Tess turned first. A circle had formed in the beach. A shallow, perfect basin about 4 feet across. They walked toward it, hand in hand, their shadows long and uneven in the fading light. Inside the circle, the sand was dry, but soft. Pressed, not blown. And in the very center, half buried, was something glinting. Not metal. Not stone. A disc. Palm-sized. Smooth on one side, rippled like water on the other. They knelt. Lark lifted it. It wasn't heavy. It didn't buzz or hum. But it felt awake. Like a lid. He flipped it over. Inside was a single word, carved so delicately it looked like it might vanish with the wrong blink. Listen. That was it. No directions. No arrows. No answer. Just the word. And then the wind shifted again. Not outward, like a breeze from the sea, but inward. Like an inhale. The seam in the cliff gave a soft click. Not a creak, not a groan, just the sound of something remembering how to move. Tess and Lark turned as the rock before them split, not like stone breaking, but like two thoughts parting to make room for a third. A narrow entrance yawned open. It wasn't dark inside. Not exactly. The air shimmered faintly, like it had been holding light for a long time and was finally ready to let some out. They stepped in. Inside was no tunnel, no room. It was a hall, long and smooth, with curved walls made of compressed layers of sand and shell. The kind of walls that whispered when you passed. Tess touched one. She swore it pulsed back. Not fast. Not urgent. Just a quiet beat. Like something far beneath them was still breathing. They walked. The hall bent slowly, spiraling not down but in. Deeper into itself. Until, at last, they reached the center. There was no ceiling. Above them, the sky returned, but higher, bluer, like it had been lifted. In the middle of the round space was a pool. Still. Clear. But not water. Not quite. It reflected nothing above. Only what was inside. Tess knelt first. She looked in. And instead of seeing her face, she saw her feet. Bare on the beach. Years younger. Drawing lines in the sand while her mother laughed from the dunes. She blinked. The image vanished. Lark looked next. He saw himself kneeling beside a seashell that pulsed with light, his own voice reading a name he hadn't learned yet. They didn't speak. Not out loud. But something else did. The pool quivered. And then the voice came. Not a boom. Not a whisper. A presence. You returned. Neither of them moved. The voice continued, not through the air, but through their chests, their arms, their bones. Not all tides turn back. But the ones who listen, they remember. Tess leaned forward, heart steady. What are we remembering? She asked. Not me, the voice said. Yourselves. The pool brightened, just slightly. And Tess felt it, the curl of every breeze she'd ever noticed, every grain of sand that had paused beneath her step. Lark felt it too, a hush before storms, the weight of stillness that had always felt familiar. They understood. The cave hadn't opened to share treasure. It had opened to show them how to hear. And in that hearing, they had found themselves again. Not changed. Not older. Just more. The voice faded. The pool stilled. And without a word, Tess and Lark stood. They left the hall. The scene closed behind them. And the line where the tide once stopped. Gone. The water now reached the driftwood again. Like the sea had finally exhaled. Stairs in the sand. Chapter 1, when the beach tilted just right. There was a morning when the wind had stopped just long enough for the sand to settle into perfect stillness. That's when Wren noticed it. She had been walking the shore alone, not for the first time, but something about that day felt quiet in a different way. Not sleepy, not lazy, more like the beach itself was holding its breath. She was used to walking in wide arcs, letting her toes press into the cool places left behind by the tide. It was how she cleared her mind, how she let the rest of the world fall away. But this time, her foot landed on something that didn't quite give beneath her. It wasn't hard like a rock. It wasn't sharp like a shell. It felt even, flat, pressed, intentional. She stepped back, brushing the sand with her foot, and there it was. A step. Not a footprint. Not a groove. A full, wide stone step, neatly carved into the sand like it had been there all along, just waiting to be uncovered. Her fingers itched. Not from fear. From something else. Curiosity. Another brush of her foot, and a second step revealed itself. And then a third. Perfectly spaced. Angled slightly downward. Leading toward the edge of the beach where the waves often whispered, but never really reached. Did I never notice this before? She whispered to herself. But she knew the beach, had known it her whole life. This wasn't something she would have missed. And yet there it was, a staircase, laid bare in the sand like the start of something that hadn't yet told her what it wanted to be. Wren looked around. The beach was empty. Not lonely, just open. Like it was giving her space. She bent down, pressed her palm against the top step. It was smooth, slightly damp from the night air. Not cold. Not warm. It reminded her of a stone path she once saw in a garden across town. Except this one didn't feel like it led to a place someone had built. It felt like it led to a memory. She sat on the sand beside the steps for a long while. Not ready to go down. Not ready to walk away. Instead, she watched the gulls overhead circling in strange, wide loops. Not in their usual patterns. Not heading inland. Just drifting above the tide, almost in rhythm with something below. Wren's gaze returned to the stairs. Only the first few were visible, maybe 5. The 6th was just a shadow under soft grains of sand. She knew how quickly things buried themselves here. Knew the tides could erase something as solid as this in a matter of hours. But part of her didn't believe that would happen to the stairs. They felt held in place. Not by force. By purpose. And there it was again, that gentle pull inside her ribs. Not a call. Just an invitation. Wren came back the next morning. And the morning after that. And the one after that. Each day, more of the stairs were exposed. Not because of her digging, though she did brush a few corners with her foot from time to time. It was more like the sand wanted them seen. As though the shore was letting her in on something slowly, like turning the pages of a book it had buried a long time ago. By the 5th day, the stairs curved. Not sharply, just enough to suggest that this wasn't a straight path downward. They turned slightly to the left, then down again, deeper, toward the earth. The beach barely showed anyone. Wren still hadn't stepped on them. She wasn't afraid. She was patient. There was something about the shape of the path, how it tucked into the dune, that made her feel like stepping too soon would be rushing a sentence that wasn't finished. So she waited, and the beach rewarded her. On the 7th morning, a boy stood at the top of the stairs. Wren saw him before he saw her. He was older than her, or maybe just taller. His hair was the same color as the wet sand, and his shirt was dotted with salt as if he'd walked through low mist. He wasn't stepping down either. He was just staring. "Did you see them too?" she asked, gently. He blinked, looked over at her, surprised, but not startled. "Yeah," he said. "3 days ago. Thought I imagined them." "You didn't," Wren said. He nodded once, then added, "I'm Leo." Wren. The names hung in the morning like shells caught in a breeze. And together, they watched the staircase for the rest of the morning. Neither stepped on. Not yet. They didn't speak much. But something between them understood. The stairs were not for rushing. They were for noticing. And as the tide began to shift behind them, gently brushing the shore, Wren and Leo stayed still. Together. Waiting for the beach to show them what came next. Chapter 2, Below the Tides, the steps hold still. The 8th morning smelled like driftwood and quiet. Wren woke before the sun reached the glass of her bedroom. Not because of any noise, but because the tide in her chest said today. She didn't question it. Across town, Leo stood at his window too, tying his shoelaces with the same care someone might tie a kite to a string. By now, they both knew the beach wouldn't wait forever. Not in a cruel way, but in the way a wave doesn't pause once it starts to curl. When they met again near the dunes, neither said hello. It wasn't needed. The stairs had grown. Now nearly 15 full steps curved downward and into the dune's edge, half shaded by the tall grass above. Some had grown familiar, a nick in the 3rd step where something sharp had once scraped across. A patch of tiny shell fragments pressed into the 7th, like a constellation you could touch. The beach around them was still quiet. No other footprints. No gulls overhead. Even the breeze seemed to wait just beyond reach. Wren nodded. Leo took a breath. And together, they stepped down. It wasn't like going underground. It wasn't even like going beneath. It was like walking sideways through something older than paths. The sand didn't close in. The air didn't grow heavy. Instead, the world just shifted. Each step was smooth but carried weight, not on their feet, but behind their ribs. The way old songs sometimes settle into your chest without warning. At the base of the stairs, or what felt like the base, the walls around them curved outward. Wren paused. There, resting against the sand wall, was a driftwood rail. Not planted like a banister, but placed. As if someone, long ago, wanted to give future feet something to hold on to. Leo ran his hand along it. The grain was soft, salt-smoothed, a little warm. "It's not wet," he murmured. "No," Ren said. "But it's been here a long time." The corridor bent again, and the sand underfoot began to change. It darkened slightly. Not because of water or stone, but like it remembered footsteps. Not prints. Just presence. Ren reached into her side bag and took out a folded ribbon. It wasn't for tying anything down. It was for marking something her grandmother had taught her. When a place feels real in a way you can't name, you leave a bit of yourself so the moment knows you were part of it. She tied it loosely to the rail, a soft blue thread against the faded grain. And onward they walked. The chamber at the end of the path wasn't big, but it breathed. It wasn't alive, not like a creature, but like a thought. Or the moment before one. At its center was a shallow bowl made from compressed sea clay, and inside the bowl, perfectly dry, sat 5 flat stones. Each stone was round and different. One had a crack that curled like a smile. One shimmered faintly, as if sand had been stirred into silver. One had a spiral drawn on it, not carved, but grown. One was smooth as glass, though it looked like plain stone. And the last was blank. Entirely. Deep gray. Soft edges. Ren knelt down beside the bowl. "Do you think it's a puzzle?" Leo asked. She shook her head. "No. I think it's a choice." He crouched beside her. "But which is the right one?" Ren didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes, reached out, and let her fingertips rest on the blank stone. A soft thrum pulsed into her palm. Not a sound. Not a shock. Just recognition. She smiled. Leo watched, then reached for the spiral stone. It didn't pulse. It hummed. Faint and musical, like the sound between waves when you're underwater. They didn't take the stones. They didn't move them. They just understood. These weren't objects. They were markers. Not of where they were, but who. They sat beside the bowl for a long time. Time in that chamber was like breath. It came and went without needing to be counted. Eventually, Ren spoke. "Do you think the stairs were always here?" Leo looked at the slope behind them, still visible, still real. "I think they wait for the right people." She nodded slowly. "Like they aren't steps to something. They are the something." And with that, the air around them shifted. Not changed, not colder or louder. Just aware. As if the stairs themselves had heard. But the beach didn't rumble. No walls moved. No wind howled. It simply waited. Because the next step was theirs to decide. And so, as dusk stretched its arms across the shore above, they rose. They traced their fingers gently over the rim of the bowl. They bowed, not out of duty, but out of respect. Then Ren turned to the stairs again. Leo followed, and hand by hand, barefoot and steady, they climbed back toward the surface, not carrying answers, but keeping something more important, a moment that wouldn't be undone by tide. Chapter 3: Footsteps the shore tried to forget. When Ren and Leo returned to the beach the next morning, something had changed. The sky was still cloudless. The tide still whispered across the sand like it was telling stories meant only for the shore. But the stairs were gone. Not covered. Not collapsed. Gone. The slope where they had been now curved into a small dune again, soft as a shoulder, smooth and untouched. Ren knelt where the top step had once emerged and brushed her hand across the sand. Nothing. No firmness underneath. No buried edge. Just warm grains, sunlit and quiet. "I don't understand," she said, the wind catching her voice and gently sending it sideways. Leo stood a few steps back, scanning the horizon. "We didn't imagine it." "No," she said. And she didn't sound uncertain. She just sounded like someone trying to solve a riddle without enough of the clues yet. For a while, they said nothing more. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew whatever the stairs had been, they weren't gone in the way the world meant that word. They were gone the way footprints vanish from sand but not from memory. They walked the shoreline in slow loops that morning, not quite expecting anything, but still alert. The tide was lower than usual, which meant new tide lines, new markings, new stories washed up from wherever the water had just returned from. That's when they saw it. About 20 yards farther down the beach, near the rocks that always seemed darker than the rest of the shore, the sand had parted again. Not into steps, into imprints. Footprints, yes, but different. They weren't soft. They weren't recent. They were pressed deep, hardened by sun and salt. And they were old. Not crumbling, not scattered. Just settled. Like someone had walked here a long time ago and the beach had never dared to let those prints go. Leo crouched beside them. "Not yours," he said. Ren stepped beside him. "Or yours." There were 4 distinct steps, all spaced evenly. Then a pause. Then the faint outline of where one foot had turned. The 5th print was gone. Not faded, missing. As if the step had never landed, or had been taken back. Ren followed the trail of those prints, or what was left of them. They didn't go toward the water. They didn't come from the dunes. They curved subtly along the stretch of flat sand, weaving just enough to suggest intention, not randomness. A slow, purposeful path. Leo stepped beside her. Someone stopped. She nodded, or was stopped. A quiet pause settled between them again, not fear. Something more like reverence. The wind tugged softly at their sleeves, and for a heartbeat, Ren swore she heard something. A single breath, not her own. Not behind her. Below. It wasn't real, not in the way she could prove. But the beach was never about proof. It was about presence. And the longer they stood there, the more she felt something familiar rising from beneath the grains at her feet. Not stairs this time. Not stone. But a pull. A soft kind of remembering. Like the shore was showing them what it still carried beneath the surface, if only someone would pay enough attention. They didn't try to dig. Instead, they marked the spot. Not with tools. Not with flags. With stillness. They sat beside the path of the forgotten footprints until the light shifted and the tide came in to test their patience. The water crept close, but didn't erase the prints. Didn't even reach them. It curved just slightly, as if the tide knew not to cross that particular line. Leo smiled. The shore remembers. Ren nodded. Even if it looks like it forgets. And just as she said it, the fifth footprint began to show. Not from her. Not from him. From the way the sun dipped at just the right angle, casting shadow across the shallowest layer of sand. And there it was, the step that had been paused. Not missing. Waiting. They followed the rest of the trail as it curved toward the high part of the beach, where the sand was firm and quiet. There, just past a drift of seagrass, the prints stopped again. This time, there were two sets. Not overlapping. Not converging. Just side by side. Ren and Leo stared at them for a long time, the wind brushing their shoulders like it wanted to share in the discovery. "Do you think this is us?" Leo asked quietly. Ren looked down at the prints, at the distance between them, at the weight of them in the sand. "I don't think it was us," she said. "But I think it will be." And as the light began to fade and the first stars began to stretch overhead, they sat beside the prints. Not to protect them, but to remember. Because some places don't stay the same. But some moments know exactly how to wait. Chapter 4, when the wind changed direction twice. The wind was different that morning. It didn't come from the dunes, carrying the soft scent of sun-warmed grass. It didn't come from the sea, pulling cool mist across the sand. It came from between. A cross-current, gentle and careful, the kind that doesn't stir things up so much as test them. Ren noticed it first. She stood at the edge of their usual spot, hair drifting sideways, eyes narrowing just slightly. "It's circling," she said. Leo didn't ask what she meant. He felt it, too. The wind was doing something they hadn't felt before. It doubled back on itself, folding in the air like a page being reread. They returned to the two side-by-side footprints. They were still there, untouched. The tide had respected its boundary. The night's breeze had not swept them away. But the sand just beyond those steps, the sand they hadn't crossed yet, looked different. Not flatter. Not shifted. Smoother. Like something had passed there that was never meant to leave a mark, but still had. "I think it wants us to follow," Leo said. Ren tilted her head. Or walk beside, she whispered. The trail began in whispers, not footprints, not indentations. Just a change in the color of the grains, like salt had settled differently there. It led them along the high line of the beach, past rocks shaped like resting whales, through swaths of dried seaweed that rustled without wind. Wren stopped first. There was a shape ahead. Not a structure, more like an impression. A long, narrow oval pressed into the sand, almost like a boat had been pulled up and set there, long ago. Except there were no drag lines. No signs of weight or wetness. Just that quiet, long dip. And beside it, one of Wren's drawings. Folded. Pinned beneath a shell that had not been there before. Leo reached for it. Wren stopped him. "Let me." She picked up the shell first, not to keep it, just to acknowledge it, then carefully unfolded the paper. It wasn't yesterday's map. Or last week's. It was one she hadn't made yet. At least, not here. But the lines were hers. The small looping strokes she made when she was tracing air currents. The soft swirls that marked where wind shifted direction. This one showed two currents, braided together, circling around the oval impression. It was titled, "Where Something Waits That Doesn't Want to Be Alone." Wren looked up at Leo. "I didn't draw this," she said. "Not yet," he replied. The wind shifted again. Not sharply. Softly, like it had just remembered how to breathe in a new way. They followed the current marked on the map. Not the drawing itself, but what it was suggesting, a path that curled around the shape and then doubled back toward the water, not quite returning, but revisiting. That's where they found the stairs again. Not the same ones from before. These were smaller. Shallower. Like they were meant for feet that didn't need convincing. Not leading down, leading sideways. Into a bluff of sand tucked behind a dune's shadow. The top stair looked like driftwood. The next, packed shell. Each one was different. Like it had been placed by someone who collected what the sea gave and arranged it in careful, quiet trust. Wren stepped down first. Leo followed. They didn't speak. The wind had quieted again, now pulling toward the center of whatever space they had entered. At the bottom, the stairs ended in a small hollow. Empty. And yet, not. There were no walls. But there was shelter. Not made by hands, but by patience. It was the kind of place that formed because time allowed it to. Here, the sand was cool and dry, pressed firm like it had been rested on before. In the center was another impression. This one round, slightly sunken, fringed by soft, bleached grass that smelled faintly like rain before it arrived. And in the center of that circle, a stone. Smooth, flat, and pale blue. Not natural to this part of the beach. Wren stepped closer. On the stone, in faint lines, was an engraving. Simple. One word. Return. Neither of them spoke. Not because they were afraid. Because they understood. This place wasn't meant to be uncovered. It was meant to be remembered and shared, but not shown. Wren sat down at the edge of the circle. Leo joined her. They didn't disturb the stone. They didn't take anything with them. But as they sat, the wind moved once more, not past them, but through them. And it was the first time either of them felt like the wind had words. Not loud, not even clear, but shaped like this. This is not where things begin. It's where they wait, to be found again. That evening, they walked back the same way they had come. The wind had stilled. The stairs had smoothed. The paper map was gone. But Wren didn't feel loss. Neither did Leo. Because some places don't need signs to be remembered. They leave something quieter behind. And the sand, when walked with care, always remembers who moved gently. Chapter 5: The shoreline that turned to meet them. The morning air was soft, and the tide was low, stretching the beach farther than either Wren or Leo had seen before. The sun hung gentle and steady, like an old friend watching without hurry. They returned to the stairs, or at least, to the place where the stairs had been. But the sand was different now. The well-worn shapes had blurred beneath a fresh layer, as if the beach had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Wren looked down, tracing a finger lightly through the sand. This place, it's not just steps or paths, she said. It's how the shore moves around us, changes with us. Leo nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. The shoreline turns to meet us, he said quietly. Like it's alive. Like it's a friend who knows when we're ready. They began to walk along the edge of the water, the cool surf brushing their feet, the wet sand smooth beneath their steps. There was a rhythm here, like the slow breathing of the earth itself. Inhale, exhale, rise, fall. With each step, the beach shifted, subtle and kind, as though shaping itself to carry them forward. Wren glanced at Leo. "Do you think it's always been like this?" she asked. "The shore moving, waiting?" Leo smiled softly. "I think it's always been waiting for someone to notice." The air grew warmer, scented with salt and something deeper, the scent of time passing and being held still. They reached a curve in the beach where the sand folded inward, forming a gentle arc that framed a narrow inlet. Here, the waves whispered differently, not crashing, not pulling away, but curling in a slow, welcoming circle. Wren stepped closer to the water's edge. The inlet sand was golden and soft, but beneath it, there was something more, a faint shimmer, like a trail of tiny stars woven beneath the surface. She knelt down, brushing the sand aside. The shimmer deepened. It wasn't light. It wasn't shadow. It was memory. Leo crouched beside her, eyes wide. "The shore keeps its stories, doesn't it?" Wren nodded, hands resting on the smooth sand. "Yes. It holds them quietly, like a friend holding a hand in the dark." They sat together in the shallow inlet, letting the tide wash over their feet. The day stretched out before them, endless and calm. They knew, without speaking, that this place was both a beginning and an ending. Not a secret to be hidden, but a journey to be carried in the heart. The wind stirred once more, soft as a sigh, lifting loose grains of sand in a slow spiral. Rin closed her eyes. She felt the shoreline turning, not just beneath their feet, but around them, reaching out to fold them into its rhythm. The stairs in the sand weren't just steps or marks. They were a way to move gently through time, through place, through everything that waits patiently to be seen. And as they rose to leave, the beach held them in its quiet way, a steady presence beneath the sky. They walked back toward the dunes, the sun dipping low behind them. Neither said much. They didn't need to. The shore had turned to meet them. And that was enough.